So as we approach any art or visual media, one of the first questions we might ask is, what is the intent of the creator and what is the subject's purpose? Perhaps we see a woman holding a red balloon that's slipping from her fingers, and we assume that the red balloon is a representation of love, and the slipping away is an indication of loss. And so perhaps this is an artist statement about love and loss. However, we might not know that, and perhaps that artistic interpretation is simply misguided or wrong. However, we as communication scholars and individuals who have the right to make arguments about symbolism can find various different forms of data and argument to back up the various different fact or value-based claims we make when we approach media and visual material. So in many instances, we won't have a proof of what the artist's actual intent was, or we don't know what the particular subject of visual communication is, and so we speculate using data, using various different connections to other media, and making well-qualified arguments. That's what scholars of communication who study visual symbolism spend a great majority of their time doing. Toward this end, they're not able to argue specifically about what the author intended, but rather about which values are evoked or are communicated by the message itself. We've previously described the trichotomy of persuasion and looked at the way we might break down any message by sender, message, and receiver. If we know the identity and values of the sender, we might ask ourselves, what are the values of the sender, and how are those values embaked in the various visual media that we're analyzing? However, if we don't know the identity of the sender, we might better turn our attention towards the message and ask ourselves what messages are included in that campaign, which include particular connections to various different values. And as scholars of persuasion, one of our key premises and assumptions is that these visual media are made with an intent to be persuasive. And toward that end, we might ask ourselves what visual materials are included to strengthen the underlying argument that that claim is making. As we analyze these visual arguments in relation to other design genres and conventions, we might ask ourselves, how is this particular image or form of media connected to other forms of media, both in that campaign and in its very representation? So if we don't know the identity of the sender and we're given little choices to speculate about their values or the background details about the creator and the artist, we might turn our attention towards the media and think about some of the questions we can ask of the medium chosen. And of course, as these forms of media often include not just visual, but often audio, graphic, and other forms of textual communication on the screen all at once, we might ask about how those interplay and associate with one another to create a broader message. We should also think about how that message might be different if it were displayed on a different platform or through different visual media. When analyzing visual messages, you might ask yourself if anything seems out of place or surprising. In this sense, you are asking if there's any juxtaposition or any strategic use of contrast to try to create a comparison or draw out a broader point. You might also ask what values are being conveyed. Does this make the product or the idea look ideal? Does it look problematic? Is it something of tradition? Is it something of innovation? How is this structured within a broader web of symbolic and shared values? And how do those values strengthen and reinforce the visual message and also the broader campaign it's a part of? The persuasive use of visual communication often tries to change audiences' attitudes, actions, behaviors, or beliefs. In this sense, we should think about what next steps are encouraged or instructed in the visual campaign message that we're analyzing. When you're analyzing the overall design of any message, there are some broad questions you can ask to try to understand why it's created the way that it is. You might first ask how it is composed. In that sense, you're analyzing what your eye is drawn to first, what the subject is, what particular types of art are used, the distinction between the foreground and the background, if there's a particular subject in focus or there's some sense of movement in the image or visual, and also how it's all arranged. Perhaps you're familiar with the rule of thirds, which often indicates that the best photos or the most pleasing photos to the eye appear in segments of 3 that can be broken or divided by a certain golden ratio of 3. There are lots of images online, and if you'd like to sharpen your various Instagram photos, certainly getting an understanding of the rule of 3 could be a helpful way to sharpen your photography. In addition, when analyzing the design of a message, we can ask what devices are used to capture our attention. Is there a particular color that's made to pop? Is information displayed or highlighted in a certain way to grab our attention? Are there some sort of effects like the sounds, motion, and animation used to otherwise draw your eye to certain forms of the screen? Are there cutscenes and transitions? And if so, what effect do all of these various forms have on the overall message itself? Finally, as we turn our attention from the sender and the message toward the receiver, we should start thinking about some questions we might ask of the audience. We already noted just how important it is to understand the knowledge the audience already has, because the audience is responsible for inferring the meaning of the message. In this sense, we have to know what context or knowledge the audience already has to work with to see if they can get some of the symbolic representations or the clues we might put in our visual media and messages. After asking what audiences already know, we should think about what new information is included in any particular campaign and how it seeks to express that most effectively. We might ask if it provokes various different feelings in audience members. We previously described different dispositions of audiences, including the sympathetic, the supportive audience, the neutral or the indifferent audience, and the hostile or negative audience. In those three different audience dispositions, we might ask how various different media create different visual appeals to those. So now that we've spent some time thinking about how the trichotomy of persuasion might help us ask questions of the sender, message, and receiver when trying to analyze their designs, it might be helpful to think about some principles to guide our own designs as we become message creators in the future. In order to improve our own visual communication, I think it might be helpful to think about some principles for various different design elements. We'll start first by talking about some of the principles for choosing the right font. When we think about typology, or the use of font on any visual form of communication, we should think about how much visual communication is needed and how we most effectively arrange that. One of the first things we need to decide when creating a visual communication message is how much of that needs to be communicated in text and how much of that can be communicated through various different forms of visual symbols and expressions. And so in doing so, we might think about the layout and arrangement of our visual material and hope we don't overwhelm individuals with walls of text. One thing we can note is that in short presentations, it's often encouraged to include less than 50 words per slide. While that might sound like a lot, this slide here includes 48 some words and is right near that edge, and so you can imagine that it's a task to be able to squeeze the amount of words you need into those short slides or short pieces of campaign media material you might be using. Those of you who are keen observers or graphic designers are certainly familiar with the way that design artists often use different fonts to convey different feelings and emotions. However, perhaps you're less familiar with the distinction between sans serif and serif fonts. This distinction can be important and helpful as you're creating different campaign media and messaging materials. Certainly it's one that design artists and typographers would know well. Among the important principles to remember when choosing the typeface is to seek to use as few as possible. There's really no reason to exceed 3 typefaces in any single instance of a visual message expression, and beyond that rule of 3, you should also think about how you might use different fonts to present specific impressions. Just a moment ago, I mentioned the distinction between serif and sans serif fonts. When we talk about serif fonts, we're talking about the small edges that distinguish the letter and make it more pronounced when it hits the page. You can see in this graphic image here those small edges illustrated in red. Common serif fonts include things like Times New Roman and Rockwell. However, perhaps you're also familiar with fonts like Helvetica or Arial. Helvetica and Arial are both sans serif fonts in that they lack those sharp, distinct edges and include rounded and curved edges. Those rounded and curved edges tend to make for better headers and better distinct larger words, but oftentimes are less effective when used in columns because they can create more blur, and so classically in typewriters, fonts like Times New Roman produced more crisp pages in the margin. This is a small but important distinction, and those who are in the know would appreciate these differences. As young children, and even perhaps today, many of us have drawn an artistic streak that knows deeply the power and potential of color to express emotion. Toward this end, we might think about the way that visual media and messages use color to better convey their arguments as well. We might also think about how various different symbols, graphics, and images are chosen to both lend credibility to a message and also to convey various different emotions and appeals. Scholars of art and aesthetics often detail and describe what they call color theory. When we talk about color theory, we're talking about the various different symbolic representations that colors have. Perhaps you're familiar with the idea that yellow is associated with prosperity, and red with passion, blue with sadness. These various different associations relate to what is known as color theory, and those who are interested in design and otherwise aesthetic analysis might better take these up to describe the reasons why particular colors are chosen in persuasive media and messaging. In thinking about the choice of color in media and messages, I can't help but think about the way that so many different candy advertisements will often use color to both make the advertisement pop, to draw the audience's attention, and to appeal to those individuals who might be most attracted to consume them. We should note that those audiences are typically youthful audiences, though we might find ourselves also purchasing those candies. The desire is to draw an audience of youthful attention so that those individuals will then appeal them to their children, hook them throughout their life, and then become lifelong consumers of whatever particular candy product they're interested in. Toward this end, the use of color in various different candy advertisements is quite persuasive.